So welcome back after morning tea. There was obviously a lot of conversations happening, a lot of catch-up, such a wonderful opportunity to network. If you weren't at the beginning of the last session, my name is Glenda Devlin. I'm the chair of FRSA's board. And I'm very pleased now to be welcoming you to our panel discussion, The Early Years, Giving Every Child the Best Start in Life. So leading this panel discussion, we have Anne Hollonds, the National Children's Commissioner, with us. So really pleased to be having Anne share this panel for us. Formerly Director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and for 23 years Chief Executive of government and non-government organisations focused on research, policy and practice in child and family wellbeing. A long story of contributing to our sector in a number of very important ways. As a psychologist, Anne worked extensively in frontline practice, including child protection, domestic and family violence, mental health, child and family counselling, parenting education, and family law counselling. Anne currently contributes to several expert advisory groups, including the Family Law Council, Australian Child Maltreatment Study, New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence and Sexual Assault Council, National Plan Advisory Group, and Early Year Strategy Advisory Panel. So I'm very pleased that Anne is bringing her expertise, and she'll introduce the 5 panellists. I invite you and welcome Anne Hollonds.
Thanks so much, Glenda, and hello everybody. Very nice to see you all. Thank you to John Graham for welcoming us to country, and I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Yugambeh people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all First Nations people here with us today. Look, this is an absolute honour to be asked to chair this panel of eminent experts to my right, on the topic of the early years, giving every child the best start in life. This session, so I'm going to say a few introductory comments. Every panellist will have a short period to basically put out their key messages to you. Then I'm going to ask them a few questions, we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then it's over to you. So after sitting and listening all morning, you might have some burning questions that you're thinking about. Get them ready, because this will be your chance to grill our experts. As Australia's National Children's Commissioner, it's my job to monitor how well our laws and policies are upholding the rights and well-being of Australia's children. One of the things I've noticed is that we often lack a set of principles or guidelines to underpin government decisions and investments. And this is how we sometimes find ourselves with these knee-jerk political reactions to tragic situations like recently here in Queensland, because governments have no compass to guide their decisions, leaving them vulnerable to pressure exerted by media outlets and so-called public sentiment. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is kind of like a compass, and it requires Australia to apply a child rights approach and ensure that the best interests of children are our primary consideration, and that we listen to children and to give their views due weight. The Convention recognises the important role of the family and the responsibility of governments to support the family and to create the conditions that keep children safe and well. And of course, this is best done by listening to what children and families say will help them. But as Catherine Little said earlier, we haven't been listening. In my national consultations for the report Keeping Children Safe and Well, Your Voices, which was done for the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, funded by DSS, I heard a lot about services being poorly designed or inaccessible because of numerous systemic barriers. Children and young people told me that they're worried about their parents who are unable to get help for things like drug and alcohol addictions, mental health disorders, domestic and family violence. Children worry about the basics such as family finances, housing and many children said they don't feel safe or welcome at school. Children and families told me that they would like to get help for different family members from the same place and not have to go navigating all the fragmented, I see someone nodding over there, the fragmentation out in the services landscape. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And having a service provider who understands them and whom they can trust is a critical factor in getting help, and this was especially important for First Nations children and families. The people who most need help, children and families living with poverty, disadvantage and complex needs, they're often the ones that are unable to get the help they need. And let's be clear, colleagues, in a rich and developed country like Australia, problems like high rates of child maltreatment, which Professor Mathews will speak about shortly, these are a sign of failed public service systems. They're poorly designed, fragmented, and they lack coordination across portfolios like health, mental health, education and social services, including housing. Currently, these public services are often based on mid-last century models and have not kept up with increasingly complex risks and needs. They're not fit for purpose for what people are saying they need in 2023. Some would argue that we have underestimated what is actually an epidemic of unmet needs, and that our understanding of a public health approach, what is prevention and early intervention, needs rethinking. Children's policy is widely dispersed across portfolios and across state, territory and Commonwealth governments. Children's policy for child health, development, learning and wellbeing has no real home. Children's policy lacks coordination and accountability and a sense of urgency. At great human and economic cost, we keep tinkering around the edges with the symptoms without addressing the underlying causes that diminish the well-being of our children and increase their risks of harm. We have allowed complexity to be a barrier to critical reform. Having just had budget week last week, wasn't it exciting, everyone? We're reminded that economic policy is children's policy. But we don't often hear those two things in the same sentence, economic policy and children's policy. While we again had a women's budget statement, which is great, and I support that, we don't report on how the budget addresses child wellbeing. In fact, if you try to find those words in the budget papers, let me know what you find, because I've been struggling. In Australia, we have struggled to achieve policy and systems reform that coordinates our public services, puts children and their families at the centre, and enables them to have a say in how services in their communities are designed. It's like we've been relying on trickle-down child wellbeing as a byproduct of a focus on adults' concerns. We've had a Minister for Women since the Whitlam years, I think. So for those of you who are very young, and there's a lot of young people here, that was the 1970s. But to my knowledge, we've never had a Cabinet Minister for Children. Like many of you, I've spent most of my career in frontline practice, like jobs like child protection, mental health, domestic and family violence. And like you, I've seen inquiry after inquiry come and go, and still we wait for the evidence to be put into action on the ground. Change is complex and difficult. But right now, I believe we are at a key milestone moment for child and family policy development. We're trying to combine scientific knowledge about the early years of life with an aspiration to improve coordination across portfolios at the Commonwealth level. The Early Years Strategy discussion paper, which many of you may have read and submitted to, states, and I'm going to quote, "The early years strategy will be the roadmap that sets out a shared understanding of what children and families in Australia need in the early years. A roadmap that can shape government policy in a holistic way and ensure we have a common agenda to drive government action." End of quote. In other words, the new early years strategy seeks to address the barriers created by the way government itself works. But there are many questions still to be answered, and we're going to get into some of those big questions this morning with the fabulous panel. And I'm going to firstly introduce the Group Manager, Families in the Department of Social Services, who are basically running this thing. And so we've got the right person here to really set the scene for us. So Tarja Saastamoinen, fabulous representative of all things to do with kids and families. She's got a really significant history in work right across Australia, and her full bio is in the pack. But I'll just leave it at that and hand over to Tarja now. Welcome, Tarja.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Anne. And can I first of all acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be here today. And also offer my thanks to Uncle John for his welcome to country, and also recognise Catherine Little and all the work that she's doing, particularly with us in DSS, not only around safe and supported, but basically holding us to account, I think, in lots of ways. Never afraid to actually hear the views from our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. So as Anne said, I'm managing the Families Group in the Department of Social Services. My responsibilities span from the joys of childhood, so the entry-level programs such as playgroups and toy libraries, through things like the Commonwealth's interests around child protection, safe and supported, for example, through to addressing issues and concerns of parents who might need additional support as they raise their children from the early years up until adulthood, and also the early years strategy, which, as Anne has alluded to, DSS is the lead agency for, working very closely, particularly with the Department of Education, as the early years strategy is a joint led initiative by Ministers Rishworth and Minister Ali, who's the Minister for Early Childhood Education and Care. So I'm just going to reflect on a few things around what we're trying to do with the early years strategy. It is an election commitment, and I won't repeat some of the quotes from the discussion paper, but it is intended to bring together the Commonwealth in terms of improving our coordination. So coordination between Commonwealth departments and agencies, between our programs, between our funding streams and our frameworks, those things that impact on early childhood development. So there are some things that we're already setting up as part of the work around the early years strategy, including we've got a Deputy Secretary's level interdepartmental committee now who's actually providing the steerage, the guidance for this. And what that committee enables us to do is not only talk about the early years strategy, but it is that opportunity to come together to talk about where we intersect, to where we actually have, common areas of interest, but also where we have different areas of interest. I mean, it's quite appropriate for health to be managing maternal and child health programs. Social services doesn't have the expertise or the role for that, but again, talking to health around where that intersects with, for example, our playgroup programs. How can we actually have referral points from, say, playgroups into the health services? So the governance arrangements we've set up allow for that conversation, that discussion, and those points of intersection to be worked through. But again, obviously we can do better. Otherwise, why are we developing an early years strategy that seeks to coordinate, that seeks to integrate, and seeks to actually put forward an aspiration for all Australia's children? So we've been asked to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing, what our experiences are, but also what are some of the barriers and challenges to that, and where we see the priorities. We've had a consultation process that started with a national summit. We've actually moved through to a pulse survey where we got 2,243 responses. We've had over 350 submissions to our discussion paper, And we're doing roundtables across the country. After today, I'm off to Brisbane and then Cairns to run roundtables. We're doing roundtables for people with disability, for CALD, for Indigenous people, for rural and remote, virtually for parents. So we're trying to actually do a fairly broad sweep of consultations. And it's interesting to actually hear the insights from those consultations. So when we talk about barriers, you will all know some of the challenges we've got, that there are a proportion of children who are not doing so well, that our Australian Early Development Census shows that there's a growing disparity between children who are doing well and who are not, that there are some families who need additional support. We've heard from Catherine around the situation for our First Nations children, particularly the out-of-home care data is showing, again, increasing rates of children being removed from home. But I also want to flip this a little and say this is not about just dealing with disadvantage. This is also about celebrating children and the value that we hold for children as they are today, not just for the productivity they can give us as adults, but it's about the joy of children playing. I mean, when we ask children what is important to them, what they like to do, they say playing. When we ask them about what's important to them, it's actually their family, their home. So we're looking at an early years strategy that will cover absolutely support for the most vulnerable children. We know that as experts, you know, there are certain things we need to do. But once we centre the voices of children and families in this, we start to get a little bit of a different lens about joy, about value, about, you know, the things that childhood actually can do in its most positive. So I actually want the strategy to focus not just on disadvantage, on deficits, but also on strengths, and that's part of our challenge. So the key themes that came out of our National Early Years Summit, which kind of support some of that, are around supporting and empowering children, parents, carers, families and communities. Inclusion is really important. So particularly of First Nations people, culturally and linguistically diverse people and children with disability. It needs to have accountability. So we need to have an enduring legacy around the early years remaining an enduring feature of Commonwealth public policy. And developing approaches that balance universal access to services and supports, but that are also responsive and bespoke to local communities. Our Pulse survey, the early results are suggesting that the Australian government should focus on emotional and mental health and wellbeing, learning and development, the material basics like water, housing, clothing and food, and strong and supportive families. And the roundtables we're doing across Australia are saying it's important to centre the voice of the child, focusing on their wellbeing and the importance of play, supporting and empowering children, parents, carers, families and communities, service integration and access, universal access to services and supports, inclusion, particularly the importance of things like Auslan, and the importance of focusing on early intervention. And what's coming out clearly is the importance of a well-resourced early childhood education and care sector. And I think that applies to things like the health sector, other sectors that are supporting families and children. So we are planning consultations with children aged 3 to 5. They will have views with a capital V. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this, but I might just stop there for now. And that's kind of what we're hearing. That's kind of our aspiration for the early years, and look forward to hearing from my colleagues. Thank you.
It is. Thank you very much, Tarja. It's such an ambitious project you're taking on, and we're really just at the beginning, aren't we? So thank you for setting the scene for us. I'm just going to speak from down here now, if that's all right, and I'm going to throw now to a very old friend, Annette Michaux, who I've worked with many years ago. Annette, of course, is from the Parenting Research Centre, but my notes tell me that she's a member of the National Coalition for Child Safety Steering Group, and it's in that capacity that she joins us today. And she's going to be focusing on the national framework for protecting Australia's children safe and supported, and talk to us about her vision for how the framework fits into the current agenda, including the early years. So over to you, Annette, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I hope you can all hear me okay. And I will be talking about safe and supported, but I'll be throwing in some kind of parenting supporty stuff along the way because I just can't help myself. And it's lovely to see some familiar faces in the room. Thank you so much for being here. As a group of about 200 organisations and researchers, the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing has lobbied long and hard, I think with fire in our bellies, as Catherine talked about, for a stronger focus on prevention to reduce child abuse. So prevention's always been at the centre of people who are passionate about reducing child abuse and neglect. Prevention is a key focus in Safe and Supported, the new 10-year framework for protecting Australia's children. I'll call it Safe and Supported from now on because I think that's a nice term. Although somewhat limited in Safe and Supported to children already facing some level of adversity and targeting, the focus areas, action plans and working groups that are going to be coming out of Safe and Supported really have a focus on a national approach to early intervention and support. So should really layer in very well with the early years strategy. And as you all know in the room, we really need to do some significant things to make sure kids get a good start in life. So I'm just going to mention 3 things as we start off. Firstly, it's National Families Week, and all of us come from some kind of family, no matter what its form. And I just want to celebrate everybody in the room for the role you play in supporting children in your own lives, in your professional lives. So this is, and the theme of celebration and positivity is very important for our sector as well. We do need to celebrate families and the role they play with children at the family level, at the community level, and at the society level. We know that children can thrive when their parents and families are supported. So my first point is, as a solution, is we need to make communities a safe harbour for children. As Catherine said so eloquently, we need to strengthen the layers of support around families. This means reducing sources of stress that families experience, and that safe harbour needs to offer families good jobs, adequate income, decent housing, quality early education and care, inclusion, moving away from some of those issues of racism that communities are facing, and child and family services that are there for all of us when we need help. So that safe harbour of support is central to the solution, I think. The second key point is supporting responsive relationships, and I know a lot of you do this in your work. So the double benefit of responsive relationships is we stimulate development and we provide a buffer to those adverse circumstances and sources of stress. Helping to build strong relationships should be an essential element of practice, services and systems. Ways of doing this include things like training and coaching our workforce in the skills needed to build those collaborative relationships that Catherine was talking about. We can help caregivers develop skills in responsive serve and return interactions so that families are building those relationships with kids. Those serve and return relationships are central to preventing child abuse and neglect. We can ensure this skill building in responsive relationships is available from birth, because we don't want to wait till kids hit the early education and care system. We know those strong relational environments at home are absolutely critical to children's wellbeing. The third point I wanted to make, which is very much related, is around strengthening core skills. So science tells us that there are a set of foundational skills, as Anne said, we all need, both to parent effectively but to get a job and to function in society. So these developmental skills are crucial for all of us. Children need to develop the very same skills. These skills essentially relate to self-regulation in many forms. So our ability to plan, stop and think before we act, to recover from setbacks. How relevant this is when we hear from Ben and look at some of the stark statistics he's going to share, our ability to support self-regulation. Building these skills moves us as a sector, I think, to thinking differently about our work. We need to think much more about how adults in families are faring with their core skills. At the same time, we need to check how children are going. It also moves us to building active skill building. So how do we need to practice? We need to build active skills, not just think about things like case management and whether people attend programs or not. So just moving on to barriers now. What are the current barriers? Safe and Supported has 4 priority kind of groups. The children and families we've talked about this morning are a real priority, so obviously Aboriginal children, families and children where there are disabilities, children in care, and families experiencing complexity. So to do something about families like that who are underserved, so it's about us serving those families better, not the other way around. All families are entitled to live in communities that are safe harbours of support, and this means looking at those upstream factors like poverty. So Safe and Supported has a key principle around access to quality services and supports. This is central, and we must keep accountable to this principle, this access issue, and we need a bit of fire, as Catherine said, to make sure all families in Australia are accessing what they need to raise their children. It's vital. When children don't receive the support they need, their health and their development suffers. So that's why this is so important. And child poverty is a significant source of stress for families. It's got long-term consequences, even when families come out of poverty. You know, there's evidence that it can really hold children back educationally. Although the effects of poverty can absolutely be mitigated by responsive relationships, poverty and financial stress wears families down. In Sharon Bessel's research, she says that children feel deeply the shame and stigma of poverty and not being able to access things at school. They describe, as Anne said, how parents in low-paid jobs and dangerous jobs can feel exhausted, they can be angry, and they're time poor. So what do we need to prioritise as a nation? Well, again, Safe and Supported has some really key priorities that we need to really get behind. The 3 things I'm just going to mention today. Firstly, and centrally, focusing and prioritising Aboriginal children and their families. This is a bedrock of Safe and Supported, and the National Coalition Steering Group absolutely supports the new governance arrangement that privilege Aboriginal voices over our own. So this is where we have to step back. It's what Catherine's asking us to do. We have to walk alongside Aboriginal organisations. We have to let go of some of our power and hand it over. That means some of our NGOs might need to lose some money and hand it back to Aboriginal organisations. We also need to support investment in ACOs. This is a significant change for our sector. I need to change and you need to change in support of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. So we really need to support what closing the gap really means, and as Catherine said, looking at how we can do that is incredibly important. Reimagining parenting support is my second point. Reimagining parenting support and early help. So just really quickly, Safe and Supported gives examples of changes we can make in a prevention system. What more work's needed, though, to make this real? What does it actually mean? Well, I think it means things like when we ask for help, we've got very few prevention services, more likely we'll get a child protection response. That is not okay. That system is not working. So given the findings that Ben's going to talk about, we desperately need to change from a system of reporting, assessment, to a system that starts with help and support, and we need a serious policy shift to prevention, not see things as a parenting failure, but see it as a systems failure. Luckily, we know what works in prevention, communities that are safe harbours of support, supporting development of responsive relationships, and supporting the development of those core skills. And finally, a key point in Safe and Supported is supporting you, supporting workforce capacity building. We really need to focus on what you need to practice effectively. Our prevention efforts need a significant reorientation away from blamey, judgy service provision to much stronger focus on supporting families when they come to us. Our precious workforce needs great pay, needs great conditions. You all need coaching, support and supervision and career pathways. Some of you get that, but not all of us get it. And finally, we need coaching and ways of working with families that absolutely work for families and support the responsive relationships and the core skills we all need to raise kids. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Annette. Really important points for us to think about there. I'm standing up now so I can see the rest of the panellists who are hiding down the row. So it's my privilege now to introduce to you Professor Ben Mathews, who is the Principal Research Fellow at the School of Law at Queensland University. I've had the great honour of getting to know Ben a little bit over the last year or more. He's led the incredible team that has done the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, or the first part of it. I mean, this is an extraordinary piece of work, and he's only got a few minutes to tell you about it now, which I know he's going to struggle with, and I don't think he's got slides. Have you got slides to show us? No! Oh my God, he's going to do stats without slides. I don't know how you do that. So, you know, bear with him, but he's got a big job ahead of him. But this is truly an extraordinary piece of work. If you haven't had a look, please Google it. It will blow your mind. Over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this panel today. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk today. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we meet, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and any and all First Nations people here today. I'd like to acknowledge each of you individually and your organisations for all the work you do as well. Also, I just want to mention I will be discussing some statistics, some numbers and percentages today, but please remember all of these reflect individual kids. They reflect individual kids who've grown up with the consequences of their maltreatment, or without consequences of that maltreatment, but they've still experienced it. So there is a deep, essential human element to all of these data that I'll discuss today. So what we did, and I'm just going to reassure you that while I don't have slides to give you today, there's just too much. But all of the outcomes of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, all of our results, statistics, publications and resources are all freely accessible and shareable from our website, www.acms.au. So we have a public report that you can download and share. We have publications that were published in a special edition of the Medical Journal of Australia in April, just last month. So 7 articles in a special edition just about our study. You can get all of those and share them worldwide. And we have infographics as well. Everything we have is available there for you. I'm just first going to say what we did and how we did it and why, just to situate what I'm going to share with you today. So we've basically done the first national survey of the prevalence of each of the 5 types of child maltreatment in Australia. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence from birth up to age 18. Now, we did this study because until now, we have not known the percentage of kids who experience these types of maltreatment in Australia. That's been a massive glaring gap in evidence, and it's meant that our policy at national and state level has been flying blind. We have been uninformed by the required evidence. So we've generated this evidence. It's benchmark evidence for the nation. We have also measured the mental health consequences of these experiences in childhood. And there are some chilling findings, both about prevalence and effects of maltreatment. So things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, alcohol use disorder, clinically diagnosed, okay, not just self-reported symptoms. We have also measured health risk behaviours consequent upon child maltreatment, things like self-harm and suicide attempt. So again, some very sobering data that we've found. And we've also measuring the burden of disease to the nation. And how we did this was basically a national survey of 8,500 people, a random sample of the population. So this is as good as it gets in terms of data and its robustness. National survey of 8,500 Australians, including 3,500 Australians aged 16 to 24. So 8,500 people aged 16 plus right through the lifespan, so we could measure trends in maltreatment over time in Australian society, and we could measure mental health consequences right through life, but also a strong focus on younger Australians aged 16 to 24 to see what the most recent experience of maltreatment is today, okay? With that, I'm going to give you 7 key messages today. The overarching message, spanning these 7, is that child maltreatment is unfortunately widespread in Australia. It's harmful, and it requires a nationally coordinated response. So not just a state-by-state and territory-by-territory response. We need to combine the forces and the economic resources of the Australian government and various portfolios and state and territory governments together. That's been one of the key flaws in our approach. Under this overarching message, I'm going to give you 7. The first is, what did we find about the prevalence? We found 4 of the 5 types are disturbingly widespread. So we found that 32% of people experience physical abuse in childhood, aged 0 to 18. So that's physical abuse by parents and adult caregivers in the home. 28.5% experience sexual abuse by anyone. So not just parents and caregivers, although a proportion of sexual abuse is in fact by parents and adult caregivers in the home. But 28.5% of kids in Australia experience sexual abuse. The next one is important. 30.9% experience emotional abuse. This is a really important finding scientifically, but also for its significance for policy and practice. This, if anything, if I was forced to give you the most important finding of the whole study, it's this one. 30.9% experience emotional abuse. I'll come back to that again shortly. 8.9% experience neglect, and 39.6% experience exposure to domestic violence between parents in the home. Okay, now that's sample-wide, our 8,500 people aged 16 plus. When we look at the results just for the 16 to 24-year-olds, they're pretty similar. Some are slightly lower, so there are some good news stories here that we can learn from. So there's a slight decline in physical abuse, that's great. There's a slight decline in sexual abuse by some types of offender, which is also fantastic. These are huge public policy successes that we can trace to developments in policy, programs, practice and investment. We can learn from that and draw inspiration from that. But some types in recent times in Australia have actually become more common. EDV is more common in our 16 to 24-year cohort than the whole sample. So it's now 43%. Emotional abuse is now more common than it used to be in the past. It's now 34%. This is disturbing. Thank you. Second key point is that girls are at particularly high risk, especially of sexual abuse and emotional abuse. So double the risk of sexual abuse, about 1.5 times the risk of emotional abuse. So this is a gendered problem as well. The third key message is that, again, this is not simply something that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. This is not just a historical artefact. This is happening now in Australia today. Okay, so we can't just pretend this is a historic artefact. Fourth is that child maltreatment is associated with severe mental health problems and behavioural harms through life. Okay, so basically half of all our participants who experienced any maltreatment met the criteria for one of the 4 mental health disorders we measured, compared with only 1 in 5 of those who did not experience maltreatment meeting criteria for one of those conditions. So if you've experienced any type of maltreatment, you've got a 2.5 times likelihood of either PTSD, alcohol use disorder, severe anxiety disorder, or major depressive disorder. The key connected point there is that those mental health disorders commence quickly. They crystallise in adolescence. Okay, so kids experience a triple whammy. They experience the maltreatment, mental health disorders, and the things that those mental health problems then affect, like their schooling, like their relationships, like getting employment. Similarly, risk behaviours, health risk behaviours like cannabis dependence, self-harm and suicide attempt are much, much higher if you've experienced maltreatment, and especially sexual abuse and emotional abuse, and that's my next point. So of all the 5 types of maltreatment, 2 are particularly harmful for those mental health and health risk behaviour outcomes. Sexual abuse and emotional abuse consistently have the strongest predictive effect. That point about emotional abuse, again, is extremely important because up until now we have not appreciated this. We have not had the evidence base. Now we do. Okay, and I'll just mention that emotional abuse itself, again, very, very significant, and we measured this very rigorously. So we asked 3 questions about emotional abuse. One was about verbal hostility. So did your parent ever insult you, humiliate you, or call you hurtful names? And 30.9% had any emotional abuse. 22% said yes to that one. The second question was about outright rejection. So did a parent ever tell you they wished you were dead, hated you, or had never been born? So really, really serious things. 8.8 said yes to that. Okay, so if we're wanting to look at some precisely targeted prevention and intervention programs, these are some of the things we need to pay attention to. So this evidence base is giving us the granular data and the comprehensive information we need to show where we can do better to prevent these things and their harmful outcomes. The 6th point I want to make is that change is possible and change is required. So we have seen these decreases in physical abuse and sexual abuse by some types of offender. They are traceable to changes that have happened in public policy, programs and investment. We should and must take heart from that. There are other major public health efforts that we've engaged in as a country, such as in smoking reduction. So we know that from a public health perspective, we can really move the needle, we can really shift the dial on these types of experiences of violence in the home. The final point that I'll end on is that Australian governments have a moral, social and economic imperative to develop a coordinated long-term plan for generational reform. We need to invest more and we need to invest better and in targeted ways. Not to overemphasise the economics, but we cannot afford not to invest even from that crude economic perspective. Obviously the moral and social imperative are superior, but the economics also tell us we must. The Productivity Commission in 2020 estimated that the national cost per annum of all mental health disorders and suicide is $200 to $220 billion. Billion. Now, our study has shown that child maltreatment is not responsible for all of that, but it is responsible for a large proportion of that. So if we don't invest more, we will continue to not only have our kids experiencing these unfortunate events and their consequences, but we will continue to have a massive economic burden flow from it. We can change and we must. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. And before I move on to introducing our next panellist, I just have to say that every time I've heard Ben's presentation, just a handful of times at least now, but every time I think my heart rate goes up a bit, or something happens to me physically. So you may be experiencing something right now. It's very hard to sit and listen to that and to not have a response. So maybe take a deep breath, whatever it is that helps you to calm down. And while you do that, I'll just tell you one quick anecdote. So when the results were launched and I was invited to do some media interviews, there was one interview I was doing on radio live where, I was sort of sharing my observations on the findings, and then the broadcaster who was interviewing me said, "Commissioner," you know how people text in comments? People are texting in. I'm getting text messages, Commissioner, to say, this can't be right. There must be something wrong with the research. Commissioner, can you tell us about this research? Of course, didn't have time to do what Ben does and explain five years worth of research, but I, shared some of those examples of what was asked, and I said that it was probably the most rigorous research I've ever seen. But afterwards I thought, it's a little bit like climate change. People, would early on especially, were turning away from the science because it was so shocking and really hard, very confronting, very hard to deal with. And I'm wondering whether this is what's happening a bit with these findings. We didn't make front page, to my knowledge, anywhere. Am I wrong, Ben? Did it make front page anywhere?
I think not the major.
Not that, no, okay, all right. Well, I know a lot of people who didn't even hear about it. So there is something going on, and I think it's really food for thought. Thank you so much, Ben. But now, moving on, I'd like to introduce to you now another professor, Professor Catherine Chamberlain. She's the director of the ONEBDA Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Health and Wellbeing at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. I'm absolutely delighted that Catherine's here with us. She's going to talk to us about the significant impact that intergenerational trauma has on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and she's going to share with us her vision for change. So a very warm welcome, Catherine.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here today. It's a real privilege. As Anne said, I'm Kath Chamberlain. I'm a Palawa Trollway woman from the north-east coast of Tasmania, and I want to also add my respects here, acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay respects to elders past and present and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, and to all of you for all the important work that you do. It's really critical. My background's in midwifery and health, so I don't come along to a lot of these events, but it's something that's really important for me to see that we are connecting better in health, particularly in those really important early years with people who are working in social services. I want to really support previous speakers' calls for a focus on First Nations children and enabling First Nations leadership, and I think Catherine Little did that so beautifully today, and the really important research as well that you've shared. It is, it is hard to hear. I think really one of the things that I think is really important, and possibly you know this, but I want us all to really get a deeper understanding that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been bringing up children in this country for over 2,000 generations, 60 or 70,000 years. And we've got a lot of evidence that around the time of colonisation, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were healthier than non-Indigenous people at that time, certainly those that arrived here by boat. We weren't sending our kids down to work in mines or off to sort of harsh boarding schools. And this state of wellbeing that was observed by the first Europeans that arrived here, it didn't happen by accident. There was a lot of science behind it, a lot of policies actually that we had, which Marcia Langton has outlined some of those in her most recent book, Law, if people have had a chance to read that. And there were a lot of practices that we had in place from before birth, during pregnancy and throughout early childhood and right throughout life actually. That's one of the reasons why we continue to acknowledge our ancestors even after death. We're designed to foster social emotional wellbeing. And our understanding of social emotional wellbeing is centred around connectedness, which I think is missing from a lot of the discussions and debate today. And in the research that we've been doing around intergenerational trauma, parents tell us they need three things: the sort of parenting skills and support, physical and emotional wellbeing, and also that connectedness. And it's a negative impact on any one of those three factors impacts negatively on the other two factors. So connectedness, and that connectedness is to ourselves, knowing ourselves, our connectedness with our family, feeling connected and safe within our communities, feeling connected and safe within our culture and who we live, the country, being connected to the land, the country, knowing it, and country knowing us and our spirit and our ancestors. So we've got this incredibly rich history that you're all a part of, everybody here is a part of as well. But we know that the violence associated with colonisation has disrupted many aspects of this connectedness, and Catherine talked about those today, and we know the dislocations from land, the massacres, the death, and a lot of the interpersonal violence that has really resulted in, severe deprivation and disconnectedness and trauma, leading to what we know has led to compounding cycles of intergenerational trauma that we see showing so clearly today. And we see this most clearly in the ever-rising rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. And I'm an epidemiologist, that's the kind of public health work I do nowadays, and we can really see really clear epidemiological evidence pointing to those compounding cycles of intergenerational trauma that we're all dealing with, and that's why it does feel like we are pushing uphill against this, because it is something that is getting more intense. So at the same time as all of this violence that's resulted in the disconnection, another thing that's really important for me as a researcher is that our knowledge about those policies and practices have been suppressed and disregarded, and even for punishments for speaking language or practising culture, some of those punishments included removal of children. And knowledge about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been generated by non-Indigenous researchers through a lens that's really blurred by racism and discrimination. And then it's this knowledge that's blurred and distorted that is then used to inform our policies and practices and being used to educate our young healthcare workers and other workers in the sector. And then it's no wonder to us that these policies and programs aren't as effective as we'd like them to be. So I'd really like to see communities being enabled, supporting what Catherine was saying this morning, to revitalise Indigenous knowledge and to develop an understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of nurturing children and relational development and fostering social emotional wellbeing again. We need to work out what that looks like in contemporary Australia. We have adapted through ice ages and many difficult times before. This is another adaptation, and we need to work out how we're going to do that. One of the questions I was asked are what are some of the current barriers and who's missing out? And I think that we can see clearly from the evidence that these compounding cycles of intergenerational trauma are driving a lot of the health inequalities and problems that we're seeing today. We have a fractured system, and perversely the most vulnerable families are those falling through the cracks the most and getting the least skilled help and support. That's one of the things. We have a really skilled workforce in the healthcare sector. I get really alarmed that these skilled people are ticking a box, and it might be getting down to people that have less skills. And we need to be all working together with your most skilled people to be dealing with these most complex issues and be really giving it the sophisticated care that it needs. And as Professor Alex Brown, who's one of our leading Aboriginal researchers, said to us all one day when we were sitting there as PhD students, you're all supposed to be smart. You've been to university. Can you stop just doing the simplistic stuff and getting smart about this and tackling the really hard stuff and getting comfortable with complexity? This is all a complex issue. We need to be working together collectively. We can't make this simple. And we're going to have to work hard together, and we're going to have to work smarter together to be able to push past this tipping point of those compounding intergenerational factors to make real change. The other thing I wanted to say, that any support, as much as it really needs to be trauma-informed, because there is the risk that support can be seen as a threat, an additional threat that can compound trauma, and so it needs to be aligned with the 4 pillars of closing the gap that Catherine was talking about, and certainly for our mob, one of the ways of ensuring safety is that it's community controlled and delivered by and for us, and men and families more broadly need to be actively centred in these discussions. we need to recentre our values and aspirations, and I'd really like to see us aspire to be the best nation in the world once again, to be able to live and bring up children healthy and happy, and for these concepts like sharing and caring for each other being part of our national dialogue, and for leaders to be promoting and championing this. So I'm feeling a sort of weird feeling, I was saying today, that a little bit of hope, which I'm not kind of used to. And I don't want to be, I don't know if I'm being naive, but I really, really think we have a good chance here, so thank you.
Thank you, Kath. And I think that so many would share that same hope and that sense of what we want to see changed. I actually think it is within our reach. You know, like we obviously need hope after hearing from Ben, but sorry. But I do think that on balance, something is starting to shift. That's what I have a sense of, and it's great to be having such a nuanced conversation this morning. So finally, and absolutely not least on this panel, is my good friend Sam Page. I say that because Sam welcome back to our FRSA. Many of you will know Sam was the CEO of FRSA. I know Sam because I was chair of the board when Sam was CEO, so that was our connection. And of course now Sam is the CEO of Early Childhood Australia. So welcome, Sam.
Thank you. It is lovely to be back in the room with the FRSA members. I've missed you. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, and of course I keep in close contact with Jackie and with Anne and with individuals, but it's been a while since I've been in a room full of FRSA folks, and it's lovely. And I also just want to acknowledge the Welcome to Country and pay my own respect to the traditional custodians of the land and accept that the land was never ceded. And I love Catherine's quote that our children deserve no less than yes. I think that's true of all Australian children. And I'll be borrowing that tagline between now and the end of the year. Look, it's hard to go last on a panel with so many experts, but I think what I have to say is really just going to build on what others have already said. Firstly, we need to make it a lot easier for families to raise children. It shouldn't be so hard. We really do need to provide secure housing, adequate income support, but we also need to provide the supports around children and families that make life that little bit easier, proper paid parental leave, good access to early childhood services. It's not good enough that we lose sight of children between the exit from the maternity ward and the school gate. We actually need to have eyes on children and a shared responsibility for children all the way through those early years. I am, of course, as the CEO of Early Childhood Australia, a big fan of universal early childhood education and care programs. And you might think I mean childcare, but I'm going to talk about early childhood education and care, which encompasses childcare programs such as long day care, but also preschool and kindergarten, family daycare, occasional care, and mobile services that operate across a lot of our regional and rural and remote areas. This federal government has come in with a platform of universal 90% funded early childhood education services, and we think that's really important, and we think that will make the work of families, the work of supporting families, a lot easier and better coordinated. If we take our lead from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service models, those services will be multifunctional. Those services will wrap supports around families and provide both high quality programs to the children, but also support to the families and carers. And I loved the plug there for the importance of play. We're very committed to play and play-based learning. In fact, ECA has a play statement coming out very soon, which I think could become part of the pillar of the early years strategy, because it really is important that we value children as children, not just as potential adults, not just as potential school attendants, but actually as children, and value the experience of childhood and the importance of play. and early childhood services have a really big role in that to play. To help families to play. I had coffee the other day, and this would not be an unfamiliar scene to you. A couple sat down with a 3-year-old child, approximately 3, enjoying their Sunday coffee, but mum and dad were both on their phones. And that child was bored, that child was restless, and it was not until that child misbehaved that he got the attention of his parents. We really need to help parents understand the importance of engagement with children and playing with children and providing rich childhood experiences. And it is difficult in this busy world and the distraction of digital devices, but we can do that together, I think. Sometimes when we talk about early childhood services, we do want a universal platform of early childhood services to be a key part of the way we support young children and their families going forward. For children under 3, the importance of those programs is really about supporting parents to engage in employment, to engage in training, to pursue their own wellbeing needs. And there's also no reason why parents can't participate in the programs themselves and be there in those services. So we're really talking about changing the way we think about early childhood services as not necessarily places where children have to be left, but where families can come and participate and be part of the program. But also where, if children are left, they're in the care of competent early childhood educators who can provide rich learning experiences, who can attend to children, and who can provide that play-based learning that we know is so important. From the age of 3, children really learn from each other as much as the adults around them. And so it is important that we have high-quality preschool and kindergarten programs in which children are engaging in collaborative learning. And that's how they develop the critical skills for lifelong learning as well as lifelong wellbeing. There's a lot of evidence now that those really rich, high-quality programs in the early years contribute not only to children's educational attainment, but also their mental health through the life course. We were all asked to talk a little bit about the barriers, and look, I know that there's been a lot of research into the complexity of barriers to accessing early childhood services, but by goodness, when early childhood services were free for a brief 3-month period during COVID, we saw a lot of children that we haven't seen before. So cost is really significant in terms of being a barrier, and not just cost but complexity. A lot of families don't understand their entitlements to childcare subsidy and other payments that are available through Centrelink, or they don't trust Centrelink and they don't want to apply for the kind of subsidies and supports that are available to them. And so when we take that barrier away, when we say you don't need to go to Centrelink, you don't need to get a subsidy, you can just come, we saw a lot of families coming in to early childhood services, and I think we need to make it that simple going forward. It needs to be really clear that everyone has the right to access early childhood services, just like children have the right to access school, that everybody is welcome, and I think we could provide, at least we're talking about a guarantee of 3 days a week of early childhood education and care as a backbone to a new multifunctional, multi-purpose early childhood services program. And I don't want to underestimate the complexity of this. We have a mixed market in the early childhood sector. We have a very privatised delivery of early childhood services and a subsidy that's given to parents to purchase services which protects choice. And I don't mean to underestimate any of those things. I think there can be a role for the private sector. I think there is a role for parent choice. I think there is an argument for empowering parents in this early years service system. However, I think we can do it better, and we can give children a guarantee of access, and we can make it a lot easier for parents to understand. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on the issue of inclusion. So the early years learning frameworks have just been revised. They're about 10 years old. They were due for a revision. And they've really put a lot of more emphasis across the visions, the principles and the practices on cultural responsiveness, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural responsiveness, making sure that all services are welcoming and support that cultural connection that Catherine spoke about earlier today. But that doesn't take away at all from our support for the Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. We absolutely at ECA believe that the ACCOs should have a much stronger role in the delivery of early childhood services. Both are true, though. Mainstream services need to be culturally responsive, and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations need to deliver the programs that their communities want them to deliver. So where would we like to see the priorities going forward? I am a big believer in the early years strategy. I'm quite optimistic about it. You would think 25 years of working in Canberra would make me an absolute cynic when it comes to visions, inquiries, reviews. I'm on my second Productivity Commission inquiry for early childhood education. It would be very easy to be cynical, but I'm not cynical. I think the early years strategy is exactly what we need. We need a vision for children, and we need to prioritise children and childhood. We need to hold government departments account across portfolios. Housing, transport, education, health, all need to be responsible for the decisions that they make and how those impact on young children and the families raising those young children. I do think there's some complexity as we work across federal, state and local government. Often the solutions are local. Local communities know what they need, and for services like early childhood services, it matters which side of the road they're available on. It matters, how many children can access a particular location. We have a workforce shortage that we need to address, and a lot of the solutions there are local. So we do need to get that coordination across the three layers of government right. And I think, lastly, we do need to address the historical gender bias in the way we value and remunerate professionals working with children, working with families. When we surveyed early childhood educators at the end of COVID, they told us they were exhausted. The work was too hard. They had managed multiple policy changes. They'd kept going all the way through all the shutdowns. They were exhausted. But we asked them why they stayed, and they said because they love the work and they get a lot of joy out of working with children and watching them thrive. And we need to recognise that that is professional work, and that should be valued and paid accordingly, without losing that sense of joy and that sense of play. So thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Thanks, Sam, and I share your optimism remarkably. I don't know how we can remain optimistic after so many decades, but I think it's something to do with the fact that I now have a grandchild in childcare and preschool, and so you've got to kind of keep hoping for the best, right? It's so personal. I'm going to divert from the plan. I'm going to go to audience questions now. I'm going to take one or two questions and then go back to my questions, because I think everyone's done a lot of listening this morning. Okay, who would like to put a question to the panel?
Thank you. Thank you guys very much. My name is Louise. I'm from Communicare in WA. My question, I think, is for Ben. We heard about from DSS earlier about how important the data and the information is to get to local people and local communities to be able to, so that they're informed enough to see change. How is your data going to get to our local communities across Australia so that families at the next door neighbour level, as well as our services, are able to then inform and see change in our communities?
Thanks, Louise. Look, basically, we have had quite a large engagement and dissemination strategy, so we have been putting our results out to the public and to policymakers and to sectors, such as through this occasion. We have all our results on our website. We're engaging with government policymakers as well at state and territory and federal level. So the results are there and they are nationally representative. So there's, you can extrapolate our results and say that it's likely that these findings apply across all states, territories and communities generally. In terms of, what sectors do with those results then, look, that's a matter for each individual sector, and that's a difficult question to answer because you're likely dealing with different types of maltreatment and different challenges, kids of different ages, parents and caregivers of different backgrounds. So that's a difficult one to answer because there's no simple answer for sectors and practitioners across all maltreatment types. But what we can say, so for example, dealing with sexual abuse and preventing and responding to sexual abuse is quite different to dealing and responding and supporting parents in dealing with, say, neglect, which is primarily poverty-driven, and which our findings incidentally showed was not substantially associated with, say, child mental health or health risk behaviours. Nevertheless, that means that at a policy level, we still want to support families who are in poverty-stricken circumstances. But certainly you can, as individual practitioners and as sectors, be aware that large proportions of kids experience, say, physical abuse, and you can be on the lookout for that, and be on the lookout for parents who may need support in dealing with whether it's mental health problems, alcohol and substance abuse problems, or other various support.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for the question. I'm going to just follow that theme for a minute and take it back to the early years strategy as well. And maybe Tarja and others might like to think about this. So, obviously we're talking about the problematic side of things, Tarja. I know it's not. I know the early years strategy is not just all about disadvantage, as you said, but one of the things I was very taken by in the ACMS was the fact that multi-type maltreatment was the most common kind, and that it's more likely to happen when there's conditions like drug and alcohol addictions, mental health disorders, separation and divorce, and financial stress, and that in the conditions where the family's living, there's lack of access to services. And I was reading all this around the time that, Alice Springs blew up, and I thought, well, yeah, there are many places in Australia where all of that's happening, where the access to services is really dire, and there's all, very complex problems. These are not small problems that a few targeted interventions can fix. So my question to the panel is, how can the early years strategy address these and other findings that show that families often do have very complex needs? Tarja, do you want to have a go?
Sure. And we'll have it resolved by tomorrow. I think one of the things around the early years strategy is also not to look at it in isolation from everything else that has been developed that's actually happening as well. So the early years strategy will happen in broadly two phases. You develop a high-level strategy which will have, vision, priorities, the things that we want to do across the Commonwealth, and then the second phase will be around what are the actions to implement the strategy. So 2 phases. But that takes a little bit of time for us to develop that as well. So there isn't actually a pause button on everything else we need to do. So we've reflected on safe and supported. That actually is one part of the response to some of the things that are happening in families and with children being removed from their homes. We know, for example, the data suggests that First Nations children are more likely to be removed from their homes due to neglect and emotional abuse. Contrary to some of the things playing out in the media, it isn't actually sexual abuse. It's not the other forms of abuse. So in terms of the impact of neglect on children, it might not be leading to, these more significant mental health issues, but it is leading, in the First Nations case, to the children being removed from homes. So safe and supported is part of the response. The prevalence of domestic or family violence and the impact on children, again, we look at the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Children as part of the response to that. So the early years strategy in and of itself won't be able to deal with all of this, but we're also looking at how it can complement what is happening in those other spaces. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges for us. Those other things, safe and supported, the national plan, other aspects also importantly have been co-designed with states and territories, and also in many cases with Aboriginal leadership and with organisations such as the National Coalition representatives as well. So it goes beyond even just the Commonwealth level.
Anyone else like to have a go as well?
I guess for me it really helps to come back to the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So when I talk about safe harbours of support, that absolutely needs national strategies and alignment with an absolute kind of bottom-up place-based approach and bringing those things together. And I think we really need to think about how we reduce those sources of stress. And we definitely have some of those solutions. We know things like affordable housing, good early childhood education and care, a proper job for people in communities. These are the things that people have been telling us are needed. We do know the solutions. We just have to work out how we can work together to do that. So I think keeping a laser-like focus on outcomes helps us drifting off into collaboration and coordination that's not in honour of the outcomes. So we need to make sure those processes don't take 7 years, they take 2 years, because they will take time, but we keep that laser-like focus on the outcome. So what is this community looking like? Are people housed? Is there a decent job? Is there proper support, i.e. a decent, is job seeker decent or not? So those kind of things are so important and central. So that's what we need to kind of put around families. The other thing, I've just been thinking on a really practical level to that question about, well, how do parents get access to this information? We've been thinking at the Raising Children Network, where we get about 200,000 parents every single day of the week in Australia going to the website to get information on parenting. Our information on prevention of abuse for adults might not be strong enough. So our responses to family violence on that website need updating in response to what is coming out of the prevalence study. So I just encourage you to look at your kind of products, the way you're communicating with parents in your communities, to see if your products, initiatives and your communications are taking account of this. Not to do it in a judgy, blamey way, parents will run away, but how do we provide support about people's self-regulation, and if they are feeling really awful, who can they turn to? That kind of stuff is really important. So it's rethinking what we do, and the Raising Children Network, which is DSS funded, is something we're thinking about, because I think we've got a way to go in some of those kind of prevention strategies.
Thanks, Annette. Sam?
What's really exercising my mind, and this is in the context of responding to 8 different submission requirements, inquiries, reviews, etc. at the moment, there's just so much consultation happening, it's all fantastic, but it's a little bit exhausting, is how do we move away from this notion that we all run individual programs and we monitor the outcomes of those individual programs, and we're in a Hunger Games kind of competition to see who can get funded the most or the right time, or how do we move away from that and say we have a shared collective responsibility for children's outcomes, and we can achieve those in many different ways? And often it's the relationship between the frontline worker, whoever they are, whether they're the child health nurse or the early childhood educator or the family support worker, whoever they are, it's their relationship with that child and that family that makes the biggest difference. Not the program model that's been tested and evaluated, not the licensed publication that everybody's running, and not the national quality standards, which is very dear to the heart of many early childhood educators, but actually the relationship that individuals have with children and families. And so we somehow need to communalise those outcomes and those responsibilities. And I'll give you a little example. I was in a remote community a couple of weeks ago, and we were visiting an early childhood service, and they pulled me aside and said that the staff had a panic attack when they knew that we were coming, because they thought we were the regulator and they thought they were going to get assessed. And they had 2 little children there with scabies, and children with scabies should not be in an early childhood service. But those children were getting treated for scabies in that early childhood service very effectively, and the staff were very concerned about their welfare and supporting the mum who'd been through a really difficult time lately, and they didn't want the authorities to know, and I absolutely understand why they didn't want the authorities to know, and why they didn't want to report it to the health authority, and why they didn't want to report it to the regulator. And go them, you know? Like, that's what we want, people who care about the children. They'll keep the other children safe, they'll keep the children away so that there's not cross-infection, they'll do the right thing, but those children are safe and supported in that environment, and we need to empower the staff in that situation to do exactly that. And to share the responsibility then for achieving that outcome for those children. It's no one service type or program or one bit of funding that achieved that. It's a whole of community responsibility for the wellbeing of those little ones.
That's a really interesting comment, Sam, and it goes to one of the questions I had thought about asking, is that, there's a number of jurisdictions now that are delegating responsibility to ACOs. There's quite a shift going on out there. And hopefully we're starting to value more First Nations ways of knowing, doing and being in communities, a much more collaborative approach. And I've been wondering a lot whether we've, have we over-specialised, over-professionalised, sort of required university degrees for for everything, when in fact there's knowledge in communities and capabilities that we haven't tapped into. And I don't know if any of the panellists would like to take that a bit further, whether Kath, you'd like to chime in. And I guess one of the questions in my mind is there a way of kind of bringing together emerging scientific knowledge with those traditional knowledges and continue to validate them and ensure that those sorts of sensible decisions, as Sam was saying, happened in that remote community, that we're not cutting out what is actually in front of us that's going to work?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. I mean, that's what we definitely want, is the combination of emerging sort of scientific knowledge and, ancient knowledge as well, drawing on the ancient wisdom from communities. And certainly we would see that kind of thing happening in ACCOs, I think, every day, and why, having that common sense community-based approach is really important. I'm just trying to think what I was going to say about that, but I
put you on the spot, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I do think it's really important. I mean, that's one of the, especially around social emotional wellbeing. The type of research I do is in, or one of the types is around evidence reviews, that's evidence summaries. And one of the things I've noticed, particularly around social emotional wellbeing, is that a lot of the Western scientific evidence seems almost sort of primitive in a lot of ways to the sort of richer understandings in community, those sophisticated, nuanced, deep understandings about how you achieve social emotional wellbeing, the importance of connections on so many levels. It seems richer, and we don't have that in the research evidence, and so bringing those two together, I think, is just really important.
Yeah, it reminds me there's this thing called radical welfare, which is kind of this movement internationally, was actually just, about, relationships, which is what's happening in communities all the time. Yep. Okay, we might go back to the audience now. There's someone that was in the queue there. Go ahead.
Hello, a panel. That was amazing today. My name is Chris. I'm from Mallee Family Care, and we're based in rural Victoria on the Murray. And I firstly want to say I'm both inspired and thankful for some of the commentary around having play groups as a platform to begin the play and first education, which can be done by parents, and the importance of play. So firstly, that's my commentary. Where I'm concerned is around, and inspired, is how early years can play a huge part in this journey forward for everyone. Where I'm concerned is, and this question is to Sam, is we acknowledge the amazing position that the educators played during COVID. But we're really concerned with the amount of leaving the sector. It's like it's post-burnout. They survived, they did their great. And we're really concerned, given that now early years is being leveraged as a platform to begin our healing and journey for improvement for all those social indicators that Ben spoke about and concerns. But I'm really concerned that we don't have enough workforce in the early years to even continue some of the things we're doing now, and concerned about, Sam, what magic wand do you have up your sleeve?
I hereby grant all early childhood educators and teachers a 25% wage increase. I do think it's not just about wages, but it is about wages. It can't not be about wages, right? So wages are the first thing, and there are very active conversations going on between employers and unions. Supported wage bargaining becomes a thing in July. We hope to be the first sector that lodges an application to do supported wage bargaining, which means that the government is at the table to help fund the wage increases that might be negotiated. And we've taken a lot of heart from the aged care wage increases that were fully funded in the budget. So hoping that early childhood educators are next. You are right, the turnover in the sector is just off the charts. It went from 30% to 40%. It's all over the place. However, we have a lot of people with early childhood qualifications choosing not to work in the sector at the moment. We did a bit of a survey of just 100 of them, and they all said that they would be willing to consider coming back to the sector. They miss the children. A lot of them have gone on to work in, like, as a private nanny or under the NDIS, often still in a profession that's sort of related. There's this kind of myth that they all go and work in Bunnings. It's not our evidence. That's not where they are. But they are sort of working in related sectors, but wouldn't rule out coming back to early childhood education. But we need to fix the wages and we need to fix the workload. It's just too hard. Can't be this hard for people. What they told us when they left is that they often slept for days because they were so tired. And that's partly COVID, but that's also because there are workforce shortages. So you get into that, downward spiral where there aren't enough people to do the work, so the people left are working more hours than they can cope with, and we need to stop that, turn it around. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Another one in the audience, there we have.
Thank you very much, Samantha, for your presentation. I am Nene Lahai from New England Family Support Service. Samantha did mention saying everyone has the right to access early childhood services, and that is very, very much true. But I just wanted to ask what the Commission is doing in the area of, let's say, postcode disadvantage, because like coming from regional and remote areas, we have a very huge concern where families are not able to access early childhood centers for their kids. We have families we support who have been on waiting lists to get their children into early childhood centers for like 2, 3, 4 years. They would be on the waiting list, and it's a very big concern. So I just wanted to find out what the Commission is doing to see that these issues are being looked at and what is being done to address them. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'll just turn to the panel. I guess it's on that theme of access, Sam, isn't it? But would you like to say more, or would someone else?
Well, I just very quickly say there's a connection between, I think, the early years strategy and the Productivity Commission inquiry, which is what I mentioned. The Productivity Commission inquiry definitely looking at that issue of why there are some areas of undersupply and other areas of oversupply, and that's because it's been left to the market to decide where they're going to build centres, and it hasn't been a planned activity. I think if we do make early childhood education the backbone of a universal system that might include family support, playgroup, might include a wider variety of programs, then it absolutely needs to be planned. And we need to see it as a public system that we're investing in that provides a universal platform. But of course, that's over to the federal government.
Yes, and speaking of which, Tarja?
Thank you. And no, I don't have a magic funding wand, but I think one of the most exciting announcements in the budget, and Minister Rishworth made I think mention of it a few times, was actually the place-based initiatives that were announced. So that's the partnership with the philanthropic sector. And it is around an investment dialogue on Australia's children. Now, it will be broader than the early years, it'll be children and families, but that partnership between government and philanthropic organisations is to work in a targeted way, to work with communities about what they want and to provide those better opportunities. So it's really early days for that. I mean, part of the budget announcement was extending the current Strong Places, Strong People initiative, which Logan Together's a part of. There's Burke project, there's one in Tasmania, there's 10 across Australia, so there's an extension of that. But I think that's one of the exciting things that we can invest in that says what do communities need without having the detail yet of the governance arrangements. There will be opportunities for communities who are actually experiencing, say, greater socioeconomic disadvantage to perhaps work with government and philanthropics, and we hope to partner with state and territory governments as well to see how we can do better to address those areas of disadvantage in particular.
So we're going to tackle that postcode lottery problem we have in Australia. Thank you for your question. Next question.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Brenda and I'm a family mediator from Catholic Care in Toowoomba. I would just like, my question is for Ben. So I guess what we hear is that with our separated families that psychological and emotional harm is really hard to prove. So I'm wondering if the evidence you've been collecting is going to help with some of that, so we're not getting so many mental health problems coming through from our young people.
Thanks, Brenda. It's a complex question, but I'll give you a couple of responses. The answer is yes, in part, it will. And I'll just go back a step to tell you what we measured when we measured emotional abuse, or sometimes called psychological abuse. So we asked 3 questions about different dimensions of this experience. In that sense, it was a more comprehensive study than many studies overseas, which normally ask 1 question. So we asked about verbal hostility, we asked about outright rejection, and we asked about emotional unavailability. And that gave us our whole estimate of emotional abuse. I'll also mention that when we calculated our prevalence of emotional abuse, we only counted it if that particular experience happened over a period of at least weeks. So if it happened just once or over days, we didn't include that in our estimate. So that gave us our estimate of emotional abuse. Now, related to that, if you're asking about emotional or psychological harm, such as mental health disorders, we measured 4 clinically diagnostic mental health disorders. And so this is where you can prove, for want of a better term, the clinically diagnostic outcome of, say, emotional abuse, or you can do it for physical abuse, sexual abuse, etc. as well. And those 4 mental conditions that we assessed, PTSD, alcohol use disorder, generalised anxiety disorder, and major depressive disorder, are very, very robust findings on those mental disorders because we administered a clinically diagnostic instrument. So that data is as robust as it gets. So yes, it's very, very powerful data. What I would also say is we didn't measure everything. So we didn't measure some other types of emotional or psychological abuse. We didn't also measure some outcomes that are below the clinically diagnostic threshold. So we didn't measure distress short of, say, clinically diagnosed generalised anxiety disorder. So there's an awful lot of subclinical distress, for example, that we didn't even count in our study. So there's a lot more that you could also assess, say, in your clinical and treatment context. But certainly the findings we have can give you good guidance on the typical outcomes of those types of experiences.
Thanks, Ben. Someone else have a question?
Hi, I'm Yvonne from Relationships Australia in Canberra. I guess my question relates to how we can swing from being reactive when it comes to funding to be able to put more funding into preventative measures so that we're able to bring some of those stats down over the longer term, particularly when they're not as easy to measure.
I think there are changes afoot. So I think Catherine Little referenced, for example, Queensland Government recently announcing a new detention centre that was a reaction to community calls for a tough on crime stance. So we are working with, obviously, a political environment, whether it's at state, territory or Commonwealth level, and you will find, governments being political creatures as well, they will react. So reactionary funding is probably something that will happen. It's just a nature of the way that governments work in a democracy. But I think we are seeing some changes towards prevention. So I think of some of the things that we're crafting up within the Department of Social Services. Some of it is still, yes, will be about reacting to issues that, we need to react to. People have actually fallen through the cracks. They are actually experiencing distress. There is actually still a role for us to play around that. But in the First Nation space, for example, we have recently designed, and I've got to sign off over the next few days, the outcomes of this, but we've recently designed a new program with our Aboriginal leaders called Improving Multidisciplinary Responses. And that is about a design of a program that helps Aboriginal community-controlled organisations respond to the complex needs of families in their communities before they fall into the child protection system. It's actually designed from a cultural base and an appropriate language base. It's in community, it's in country. So that's actually an example, and that's taken longer to design and develop than we'd originally envisaged. I think we were hoping to, roll out funding last year. But one of the lessons learnt in terms of a co-design and a partnered approach is it will take longer, and it will take longer for us to get it right. In this particular instance, we also designed new ways of actually communicating the grant opportunity to our Indigenous communities, to our Indigenous partners, and that included not just the usual release on, a tender, but there were calls. There were actually discussions held with communities. There was follow-up by if our Centrelink and Services Australia colleagues were going out into communities for other visits, they did a bit of promotional work. They spoke in language. So we're starting to learn a lot more, particularly in the First Nations space, that we could probably apply to other spaces as well. So we are seeing a shift. It does take a little bit to do that, but it will probably always be that balance of some reactivity and some, hopefully, better efforts around prevention. The wisdom of our First Nations leaders, I remember many years ago when I was in the Office for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health, and Mick Gooder was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. Mick Gooder and Professor Tom Karma were the co-leads for a movement called Close the Gap. Grassroots level, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander led. That was taken up by the then Rudd government as Closing the Gap. And I remember Mick Gooder and I were having a chat about the first Closing the Gap targets, which were all sort of like focused on deficits, really, improving life expectancy, a few things, that really focused on the gap, and the language was around the gap. But what he actually said to me was that focusing on the gap, on the deficits, actually is the impetus for change, is the impetus for investment and for effort. So he accepted that sometimes we focus on the gap because it actually moves governments, it moves communities to do something. That moves them, and then we can come in behind and say, okay, you're now moved to do something. Can we actually work on this from much more strengths-based and early intervention place? So as I said, the wisdom of our First Nations leaders, I remember that 10 years later as something that I hope to take forward as a message as well. The child maltreatment study results, that is our impetus for change, but how do we then work a narrative that says we need to build on strengths? So that would be the way that I would look at it.
Thanks, Tarja. And that it's interesting to be reminded of that, where the Closing the Gap came from. And it has taken time, but I think that generally there's a sense now that we've got things moving, and we can perhaps end on that as a sort of an optimistic note in terms of the conversation this morning. We need to let you go and have some lunch, but before, just by way of closing, I just wanted to say that I've certainly been inspired by listening to the panel this morning. I hope you have been too. I do believe that change is within our hands, and some of the panellists have actually mentioned specific things that each of us can do in our own practice or policy or research environments that we're working in. I would also urge that we need to speak together with one voice for children. So whether you're a mediator, as Brenda was, or you're in some other setting, we all share an absolute commitment to have the best outcomes for children, and I think we need to back each other in this sector really well, and to amplify our shared voices to our elected representatives. At the end of the day, child wellbeing needs to be a bipartisan priority, and that's up to us as the public. And we need a sense of urgency. So as Annette said, we need 2 years, not 7 years, for this change to happen. And again, the momentum needs to come from us, the public, who vote. Kids don't vote. I've been told that many times. There are no votes in children. I've been told the reason it's been slow is because there are no votes in children. But we who can vote, we need to use our vote and make it count for our kids. Thank you very much, everyone.
Can I just make a few points before we go to lunch? I just want to again highlight the value of the data source we have and encourage you to, if you haven't, write down that website. I was looking at it as you were speaking, Pen, and really easy to access, really great data. And so www.acms.au, easy to remember. I really encourage you to go there and have a look. I love the fact that in this panel there was a little hope, a lot of optimism in the midst of big challenges. There's obviously great focus, energy and capability on this panel and in the sector, in this room, to give children a better start to life. So we don't just bring capability, we bring heart and wisdom, including the heart and wisdom of Aboriginal people, which we really need to draw on more. Not just for the work of Aboriginal people, but for us in Australian society. It's complex work, but we need to collaborate. What an important point brought forward there. And we can make a difference, particularly if we build on the strengths that we have. Such important messages this morning. Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much, Kath, Tarja, Ben, Sam and Annette, for your contribution to the panel. And